Welcome back to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Today we have a very special guest. This is a man who's been in the industry for over 25 years. He has seen small teams. He's been a producer and a game developer at EA. He's done the independent thing. He has moved around the world. He has seen how development works in China. And now he is financing his next magnum opus through crowdfunding. And he is here today to talk to us about all of those changes he has witnessed. Welcome to the show, American McGee.
Hey, Carl. Thank you for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Glad to have you here. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to develop a game, how did you get started with games, programming, designing in the first place?
So I was really interested in computers from an early age. I think that I was gifted my first computer. It was a Timex Sinclair 2000, and fell in love with it right away, just in terms of being able to program it to do things on a TV screen, And then I grew up in a really poor neighborhood. My family didn't have a lot of money, but I kept getting hand-me-down computers, and then I was sent to a TAG school, so a talented and gifted school for science and engineering, where there was access to computers. So I had a lot of exposure to it, but quite, early on, I think I was 16 or 17, I was forced to drop out of high school due to some family problems. And that derailed my hopes for doing anything at all other than what I went off to do, which was become a car mechanic. So I was working on German cars, primarily Porsches and Volkswagens, and I wasn't doing much of anything with computers until one day I had become friends with John Carmack. Strangely, he was living in the same apartment complex as I was, and we would play games together. And I think he recognized that I had abilities and skills that were perhaps greater than, catching myself on fire while replacing fuel pumps, under a 1989 Jetta, right? So
that sounds like a very specific situation you're describing there.
I did catch myself on fire a few times. It does happen. I knocked myself out with a cherry picker once. I was pulling an engine out of a car, and the hook on the chain that you use to lift this hydraulic lift, you lift the engine out of the car. It slipped, and the chain flew up and hit me in the side of the head. So,
damn.
Yeah, it was definitely a different type of thing from where I ended up, which was at id Software. John invited me to start working there. First, I went up there. I was doing beta testing on the first Doom game. And then after a while, he invited me to join the team initially as a tech support person. So I was just answering the phone calls. If you were having problems with installing Doom, or, you thought Doom had burned your house down or whatever, I was the person you got on the other end of the phone. And from there, I just started training myself in the tools that were being used in the studio, and was able to transition myself into being a level designer, among other things.
Cool. And so that, obviously that transition from tech support to designer, I'm guessing that it at that point was such a small company that there was no, I need to go talk to the manager to be able to get clearance to do this and things like that.
Yeah, well, I was employee number, I think the number is 7 or 8, and that's including Donna, the receptionist, at that time. So there was a very small team. It was John Carmack, Kevin Cloud, Adrian Carmack, John Romero, Sandy Peterson, Dave Taylor, Jay Wilbur was the CEO, BD person. Donna was the receptionist. Who else did we have? Me, Sandy, Romero for level design, John for programming, the 2 artists, Dave for programming, feel like I'm leaving somebody out, but I think that might have been it at that point. It was a really small team.
Gotcha. And so you come on, and your first levels are then in Doom 2 or in one of the expansion packs?
I can't remember what the dates were. For sure, I had levels in Doom 2, and I also had levels in the expansion packs, but I don't remember the order of release of those things. I feel like my first levels were actually featured in Doom 2, and then we started doing expansion packs, but I could have that backwards. There may have been levels that I did that were in expansion packs for the original Doom, but I don't think that's how it went. I think it was Doom 2 and then expansion packs. And then, I did work on a variety of other things that were like the Jaguar port of Doom, and other projects along those lines of porting to various odd systems.
Gotcha. And so once you make it to become a designer, what is the process internally at Doom for getting levels approved or getting product in? And are you just a full-time salaried employee at this point, or are they using some other kind of compensation structure?
So let's talk about the salary thing first. I think as a car mechanic, I was making like 15,000 US a year. And I made a little bit of money on the side if I helped to sell a car, because the shop where I worked was a shop and a sales place. John hired me into id at $30,000 a year, which at that time I thought that was like a king's ransom. I thought, wow, $30,000 a year. At that point, I wasn't even sure if anybody in my family had ever made $30,000 a year. So I thought, wow, this is it. I've made it. And I was just hired, as an employee, like regular old, like, hey, you're now getting a paycheck from id Software. Here's your desk. So I had my own desk and my own walls and a door and an office. So I was just brought in. I mean, I take that back. The my own desk and door didn't happen until after I became a designer. So when I was in tech support, that was the first maybe 6 months or something. Sean Green and I shared an office, a room. That's the name I forgot to mention was there with me, was Sean. And so we shared a room where we had phones and, we answered the phone calls. And then once I showed proficiency in building levels, which is what I was doing if you were talking to me on the phone and called and said you were having problems, I wasn't really paying attention to your problems. I was sitting there building maps. So once they transferred me to work on levels, I think I got an immediate raise to $60,000 a year, which blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do with all of this money? And then that series of raises continued over the course of the next 4 years, interspersed with very large bonuses whenever the company was doing well, receiving royalties. So, the owners were bonusing themselves millions of dollars, and they were throwing us, the occasional $75,000 or $100,000 or $35,000 bonuses. So you can imagine. I mean, I was 20 years old, right? I was 21 years old. I think that by the time I turned 23, I was making like nearly $500,000 a year in salary and bonuses.
Wow.
So it was a wild ride. So that was sort of the compensation employee thing, As far as your other question about the process of approvals to get content into the game, I mean, I think this is fairly well known for anybody who's read the Masters of Doom book by David Kushner, I think his name is.
Yeah.
And I think he makes it pretty clear that it was a sort of very disorganized chaos. And one of the things that, is famously said of, I don't know which game it was, but they all basically ended up the same way was, we didn't know the story to Quake until we had to write the blurb for the back of the box. Right? And that's not BS. I mean, that's really, it was like, that was basically how it went. For me specifically, what I remember in working on Doom 2 and working on Quake was we as individual level designers had our own style. So Sandy had a very particular style. Romero had a very particular style. I had a style. And I would just go into Kevin and Adrian and say, I need a texture pack. I quite like dark metal and black, and I love lava. And so then Kevin and Adrian would nod their heads. They both were very stoic, very quiet in there. Machiavellian, by the way, is another word you could use to describe Kevin. But they would nod their head, and in a few days or a week later, I'd have a texture pack, and I would just go build levels. And at that time, I mean, so much of what we built, it just came out looking awesome that I think it was hard to say, no, throw that away, or no, where does that fit in? Because we were making, with the levels, we were making things no one had ever seen before in terms of geometry and lighting and action. So there was no process. There was nothing of the sort. You built stuff. We play tested it constantly in death matches, and then there got to a point where it was like, I don't know. I think we're out of time. We need to ship something. All right, put all that stuff in a box. There you go. There's a game. Ship it.
Okay. And so I'm guessing at this point also budgets and so forth weren't a particular concern. It was just you had a release date and that was it.
Well, so in my position, I was never aware of anything related to budgets. I never understood the environment I was in as anything other than a giant money fountain. So, people were buying houses and Ferraris and wives and, lifestyles of the rich and famous, right?
Yeah.
And never once did I hear the company say, or I was never privy to, or in any sort of conversations around the company finances. All I knew was that the exterior appearance of the situation was, hey, that guy, Adrian just bought a Viper. Oh, hey, look, Romero just bought another Ferrari. Oh, hey, look, Carmack has just bought another Ferrari. Oh, hey, look, so everything finance-wise was hidden from us, but you could see the obvious effects of the flow of cash. And then as far as dates and delivery dates and stuff, I don't ever recall there being like, all right, guys, we're going to start on this. We've got 9 months, and by this date, we're going to have everything ready to deliver. I don't remember that. Now, maybe it happened, and I've heard Romero, I think I've heard him suggest before that he had a plan and that he was guiding this kind of stuff, but I've either forgotten that stuff or it didn't happen. And I can't say which of those two things is more likely, but I only remember that there would come a point where it was like, we've been working on this for over a year. What's everybody got? Okay, let's put all this. This looks fine. Get all this together. Get your stuff finished. Okay, we got to shove this in a box. Okay, somebody write the copy for the back of the box. Okay, shove it. That's what I remember. I don't remember like, hey, we're all working towards this date. Get the thing in the box. Let's go. I mean, in the final weeks, I remember there being a kind of extra crunch. I mean, you didn't have to crunch us because we all liked being there. We all worked our butts off. Yeah. But I just don't recall the concept of a schedule except in the final weeks leading up to, hey, we got to shove this thing in a box. Gotcha.
Now, so you stayed at id for quite a while. And if I'm reading the history correctly, up until you were still putting in design work into Quake and Quake 2, and then there was Quake the Offering. I believe it was an expansion pack up until 1999. At what point do you make the decision that you're going to start working outside of id?
Well, I didn't make the decision, so okay. I was fired. And the way in which I was fired was shocking to me in terms of, I shouldn't say the way in which I was fired. It wasn't like they took me out behind the building and beat me with baseball bats and said never come back. But when it happened, it felt like that because I was completely unsuspecting of the notion of being fired. I felt that I still had a strong relationship with John Carmack, which in a company that small, relationships mattered, politics mattered. And I still lived. No, actually, I had moved away from living next door to him, so maybe that was my first mistake. But yeah, so I came into the office one day. We were actually doing ramp up to design things on a new Quake game after Quake 2. And they called me into the art room and they said, "We're letting you go." And that was it. And they didn't give me a reason other than it's just not working anymore. And I felt that was surprising given, having been there for 4 years. And if you look at my record in terms of credits, you'll see that I produced a significant amount of the level design content that went into all the games that were produced while I was there. So it was a shock to me. And, I think it took me quite a while to get over it. It took me much longer to understand, maybe why they would have let me go. I think I had just become complacent. I was having a lot of extracurricular fun outside of the office. I was still partying with the Nine Inch Nails guys and everything that implies. So I think I'd sort of worn out my welcome there. So yeah, I was let go, and I actually went and worked with Romero at Ion Storm for a few weeks. I did some sound effects on a game there, and then I got a really weird phone call that led me to working with Michael Crichton, the author and film producer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that project was what led me to EA.
Okay.
So
just out of curiosity, what was that project?
So I was still in Dallas. I hadn't made a move to get another full-time job anywhere yet. And I got this weird phone call or email or something out of the blue. And they said, "Would you be willing to come to North Carolina for a secret project? We can't tell you about it until you get here." And the really weird thing was at the time, I was actually in the middle of reading Michael Crichton's autobiography called Travels. So I get flown out to North Carolina to Cary, some tech park there. And I've got that book in my hand and they sit me down in a room. And then he walks into the room and he's like, "Have you got everything you need? You don't want a Coke or anything? I'm Michael." And I was like, "Shit, I'm reading your book right now." And at that time, ER was a big thing on TV, right? So he's the creator of ER, and we were watching. We've been big fans of that. So anyway, that project eventually got titled and turned into something that he wrote a book, and then it got turned into a film called Timeline. So at the time where I was introduced to him, all that was known was that there was going to be time traveling back to France during the Revolution, and we were going to make a video game about that. And so I worked with that team. I worked with Crichton quite extensively. I mean, a lot of the ideas that ended up in the book and in the film were ideas that we generated together in creative sessions. So I learned a lot from him. I had a lot of fun. But EA came along and said, "We are going to become the publisher for this." And then they offered me a job. And after they offered me a job, they were pushing me to continue to do due diligence and reporting on what was going on with the project. And I got to a point where I felt this project's going to fail. And I've never been one for politics. I've never understood it very well. I tend to be really blunt. When I see something's broken, I say it's broken. So I went into EA and I said, "This thing's broken. I don't want to be associated with it anymore." And they were shocked because EA is nothing if it's not just a giant ball of political nonsense. People, constantly covering their asses and shifting blame and unwilling to take responsibility or put their foot down for anything. So that I was willing to sever the connection to the rock star Michael Crichton and to say that EA should walk away from this project was like this really big deal, which got me promoted to like a super high level creative director within EA. And and they canned the project, which severed my relationship with Michael. And by the way, that game came out and it went on to sell like one copy. And the book and the movie were kind of crap. So I think I was ultimately justified in saying that it wasn't going to work for whatever that was worth. But because I had been willing to take a strong stance on the situation with that project, they then decided, hey, you're really good at being a jerk. And so we're going to send you around the world to all these teams that are struggling, and you're going to report back to us whether or not we should kill those companies or those projects.
Oh, wow.
So I spent a year flying around the world on EA's dime to everywhere from Texas to Tokyo and everything in between, and checking out and doing due diligence on all these various projects and seeing all these teams and digging into the nuts and bolts of all the productions. And I had no reason at all to be that guy, you know? I mean, it was crazy, but I managed to make a couple of, smart calls, and I managed to help pull a few projects out of the fire. And but I got sick of it because it got to a point where I went and visited a couple of studios where I would walk in the door and people in the office would start crying because I was known for being that guy who, if I came to do due diligence from EA, that was a really bad sign. And I didn't understand that. And then it started happening more and more, and it really started to get to me. I was like, I don't want to be like the Grim Reaper. I don't want that to be my legacy. I want to make things. So yeah, I kind of put my foot down again. I said, look, I'm not doing this anymore. Get someone else to be your cleanup guy. And they responded positively again and said, all right, you want to make your own game, which was bizarre. But they offered me the chance to come up with a game concept, pitch it. And I pitched Alice, and they liked it, and they let me go off and make it.
And when you say you went off to make it, obviously this went through all these experiences of doing due diligence and checking out what the companies were doing. Was that process now looking at their financials? Was it just looking at the product to see whether or not it was going to be viable? What, if any, system did you develop for making those decisions?
So I was never involved with the financial examination. There was always somebody flying with me who would do that. And they paired me up with a variety of people who were more on the finance side that would do the financial examination. But sometimes it wouldn't be that at all, because a lot of times the issue wasn't one of, it wasn't a question of did the people waste their, or otherwise do something illegal with the money. So that was never the conversation that was going on with me in the room. And I mean, normally when it comes to game development, if you've got a really good project and you've got people who are saying, this is going to turn out to be really good, then whatever minor wiggles in the finances don't really matter, right? So what I was out there to do was to dig into their production. So I was sent to talk to people first and foremost, and that meant that a lot of times EA had lost faith in the reports that they were getting from the higher level managers or from the lead, like say it was the company director or the lead game designer or the lead producer. I was sent in whenever EA felt that those people weren't being forthright about the reality of the situation. So my job was to bypass those people and go talk to the people under them, and then also to examine their pipelines in terms of asset production and scheduling and resource management. And then, everything from, how long does it take to get a piece of art into the game and then scripted and then acting so that you can test it. And there'd be times that we would go out and I would find that, just the way that their development systems were built, there were incredible bottlenecks for just getting an animation into an engine and testing it. You just couldn't believe the number of hours, that a team would spend trying to get the technology to do something really basic. And that oftentimes would reveal that there was a technologist lurking somewhere behind the scenes who refused to listen to the team's requests for these types of improvements to the tools. And that would ripple throughout the entire process and cripple these teams. And I'm just using the technology, the evil technologist as an example. I mean, there were broken pipelines as a function of every imaginable thing under the sun. But, that's just a convenient one that I think a lot of people could understand. But I encountered all kinds of crazy brokenness. And that was my primary focus, was just going there and saying, right, how do you make games? Who's making the game? What's the pipeline you use to make the game? Where does it start? What's the middle part of it? Where does it end? Show it to me. And a lot of times people would you would just see the whole thing break down, in the process of just asking them to show it to you. It was just, the whole process would just break down. So I learned a lot, though. I learned a lot about people. I learned a lot about the interaction of various personalities within development organizations. And I learned a lot about how people can really mess each other over. Because I found that time and again, that you had a lot of different people who they believed they all shared the same intention to build a vision of a product, but due to their personal or interpersonal issues, they were just screwing each other over left and right, and they weren't going to get a project done.
Sounds a bit sad, but also, a necessary function in a certain way, especially for an organization like EA.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had people ask me in the past, what's the hardest thing about making games? And my answer has always been people. People is the hardest thing about making games.
Very true. Very true. So you're allowed to create your own game. Now, do you put together your own team? Do you search out a team that's already inside the EA umbrella? What is your first step when you're told to, that you're allowed to do this?
So I was 24 or 25 years old, living in San Francisco in the middle of the dot-com boom. And we partied a lot. So I think when I first got the word that come up with an idea and pitch it, I think I just went and partied for a week. But there was a moment where I was driving along the California coast, and I was listening to a particular track of music in which the word wonder was said. And that triggered in my mind Wonderland, and it all just kind of flooded me from there. I'd had a notion about Alice in Wonderland as a video game previously, and this still sounds really silly, but the idea of making a dark Wonderland hadn't really struck me yet. And that moment was where I had that epiphany of take Alice in Wonderland to some place it's never been before. And it was, for me, a bit of a shocker that no one's done this yet. I was pleased to sit there and rummage through my mind and think no one's ever done a really twisted and dark Alice in Wonderland. Great, let's do that. So I made a pitch that leading up to the pitch, I had to engage a bunch of concept artists to help flesh out what it was, what it looked like, who the characters were, what they looked like. And while we were doing that, I was searching around for developers. And now when I was at ID, there was a small development team down the hallway called Rogue Entertainment that was headed up by Jim Molinetz. And they were not just, a team down the hallway. They were friends of mine as well. And when this opportunity came up, I was still in contact with them. And there was something else going on about one of the projects they were working on. But anyway, I was aware that they were in a position with regards to the Quake technology to do something very cutting edge. And I also knew that they were really good artists and they were good storytellers. And I knew that they were a good and competent and honest and functional team. Because like I had just been doing this global tour of dysfunction, right? So yeah, I mean, I hooked their name up to the pitch. I took all the artwork in, and the powers that be said, yes, you can make this. We'll give you $3 million to make it, which in 1997 dollars, that was a good budget. It wasn't a small budget. It wasn't a huge budget, but it was all right. So they gave us $3 million in 2 years, and they hooked me up with an executive producer by the name of R.J. Berg, who then went on to be my mentor, my writing partner, my creative partner, my business partner. He and I we've stayed connected at the hip and in business together since that moment, leading up to today, in fact. So RJ and I, co-wrote and created and crafted this thing and guided the team at Rogue, who were based in Texas, guided them through the project. And shipped a game.
Cool. And now this game comes out in 2000. Obviously, we're talking about Alice, American McGee's Alice. By the way, absolutely loved it and only got through it because I downloaded a cheat mod for it. I suck at jump and run and stuff. So
was that the floating lily pad thing that screwed you up? That screws up a lot of.
Oh yeah. I busted my head against the wall on that one, and I was playing it during my first year of law school. So any C that I got is you're partially to blame. But yeah, no, I absolutely loved it. And I was very surprised at the time that it was only released for PC. What was the planning on and the decision making on platforms to release the game on? Because at this time, obviously the PC is still a big, important market, but consoles were really coming into their own again. As a market. So why was that decision made to only make it as a PC title?
Well, this was not my decision to make, but it was a decision that was made by the executives at EA. And by the way, it's one of the things that occurred at the end of development on that project, which led to my quitting EA. And I quit in disgust. So what happened? Well, we finished the PC game. We finished it. I'm pretty sure we were largely on time and on budget, if not exactly on time and on budget. We certainly didn't slip or have sort of the sort of disastrous nonsense that was going on with so many of the teams that I saw when I was doing my tour of disasters, and that was one function of the frustration that I then experienced when I felt like, hey, I've seen a bunch of teams do a lot worse that you treat a lot better, EA, than this team that's just delivered something that is getting really high review scores and was delivered on time and on budget and on spec. And yet they were acting like, well, we don't really know what to do with this team. And they had wound up that team, the guys at Rogue, they'd wound them up to believe that once the PC version was done, the console port was coming next. They had wound them up on that path so far if I recall correctly, that the team actually went out and spent a large portion of the money they had cash on hand towards the development hardware necessary to do the console port to the PlayStation, maybe also to the Xbox. But I remember that they spent money that in effect they didn't have because they expected that there was more money and more work coming down the pipeline. So they went and got themselves in a position of financial insecurity, preparing for the expectation that console port work was coming, and then EA pulled the rug out from under them, and they were dead within a few months. So it was a tragedy. And to add insult to injury, as I protested all of this going on, I had people looking at me and saying, well, we'll send a due diligence team out there to analyze, what they're good at. And I'm like, what are you effing talking about what they're good at? They just shipped the freaking game for you, look, just look at the game, So then to add even more insult to injury, they turned around and fired my creative partner, who at that time was a 14 or 15-year veteran of EA. He'd been there, and worked on the very first Madden game, and he had done no wrong to them at all. And they unceremoniously fired him at the end of him playing a role in seeing this game made and delivered on time, and they just fired him without batting an eye. Now they knew me, they knew my personality, and I was angry. I was really angry about all of this stuff. And they tried to entice me to stay and sort of come to the dark side by offering me a place in their sort of VP placement, VP training program. And I responded by quitting. And that was the last time I ever worked for anybody else. It was wow. It was heart-wrenching. It was like we'd done everything right, and then there I was, the last man standing in this crater of destruction, and being told, it's okay, just take our hand and join us, come to the dark side. It's like, you just murdered all my friends.
Yeah, but there's a few more younglings left. Oh, wow. Okay. So, what do you, so you've brought this game in, you brought it in on budget, and you worked with an outside studio that is now no more. What is your approach to the next move?
You mean after I'd left EA?
Yeah.
So while I was there, while we were working on the development of Alice, a group of producers had come up from Hollywood, and they had orchestrated the purchase of the film rights to the Alice IP. And that had involved my going to Hollywood and sitting in a room with Bob Weinstein. That's the not rapey one, by the way. It's his brother.
Yeah.
So I went and pitched this to Bob Weinstein, and, he bought the thing in the room, and it was like, it was very Hollywoody type of situation. But they also offered me what's called an overhead deal, which basically just means that the studio, which was Miramax Dimension, which is a function of Disney, that you get paid every year a certain salary to sit on a creative team and come up with ideas and be involved with projects and stuff like that. So I took that deal. I took the overhead deal at Dimension, which put a bunch, money in my hand and kind of brought me into Hollywood, into the life, right? Like, I had an agent, I had a manager, and I had a studio deal. And so I moved to Hollywood. I bought a Spanish villa thing under the Hollywood sign. And I actually partnered up with Dave Taylor, who I'd worked with at id Software. We reconnected and decided to start up a transmedia development company, because that was the hot thing back then. Hey, let's not just make a movie. Let's make a movie and a game and a toy line and a amusement park and a so yeah, we started up a transmedia company called Carbon 6, and we floated along with deals that came out of Dimension. I remember Dave worked on a Spy Kids movie, video game adaptation, and we had a couple of other projects that were Hollywood film related, and I had music video and TV commercial directing work that I was doing. I got signed up at a production house that did film, TV and music video stuff. And so that, was fine. I got writing deals on films. I sold another film project to Disney, which was The Wizard of Oz. So, there was sort of 4 years there where I lived in Hollywood and did Hollywood things.
Gotcha. And when do you start moving back into games? How does that come about?
I had still sort of dabbled, and like I said, we had projects that would come up from time to time that had game components. So I still did some game stuff, but there was this moment after 9/11 where the U.S. descended into what we now label fear culture. You had these different terror alerts and stuff like that, and there was a company called Inlight based in Hong Kong who had me coming over and working on projects with them as a consultant. And I was starting to see kind of the beauty of trying to get out of the U.S. Like, I'd always wanted to live in Japan, but I'd passed up the chance when I'd had it. And here was opportunity to go and work in Hong Kong in Asia. So I did a few projects with them until they said, hey, we'd like you to develop a game for us, much like EA had done, a few years back. And I pitched them a couple of ideas, but they kept rejecting everything for being too simple. Now, I was trying to pitch them things that I thought were relevant or appropriate for their level of development skill. Because again, I had experience with that, and I understood this team, and I was like, hey, you guys shouldn't try to bite off more than you could chew. But they would not be dissuaded from a full-blown, narrative-driven, third-person action. Like they wanted to make their own, like an Alice game, but they wanted me to write and create a new story. So I tapped into the zeitgeist in that moment, which was fear culture, and I came up with a concept called Bad Day LA, which features themes that if you were to put them alongside what's going on in the US right now, 2020, you would think I am the Nostradamus of video games. I am not joking. I look at what's going on in the news right now, and I think, wow, did I make that happen by making a game about all this stuff? So it features all of the worst things about American culture as that pertains to race and violence and sexism and, just gross, shiny, vapid Hollywood culture. And, just the whole thing and also intermingle all that with fear culture, with the constant sense of living in a disaster-filled world, right? So that's what Bad Day LA was, and that got me back in working on that.
Yeah, and Bad Day LA, I remember seeing it at the time and thinking, it's probably brilliant, but yeah, it wasn't what you would call the most well-reviewed game in history.
I'm very proud of the fact that with Alice, which was my first independent, designing on my own, asked to make a game. I won a game of the year award at GDC. I don't remember who gave it to me, but some magazine or the event itself or something gave me and Alice game of the year. And then some years later, I put out Bad Day LA, and I won worst game of the year. I really think that's an achievement. Anybody can win game of the year. A lot of people could easily win worst game of the year, but I think it's a real accomplishment to be able to win both best and worst. So.
This is probably, you're right. I can't think of anybody else who's ever been able to do that. So congratulations.
But it's funny that now, if you go watch people doing Let's Plays of Bad Day LA on YouTube, or if you just go look it up on Google, like I just saw it the other day because people are always asking me to play it again or talk about it. I think that like on Metacritic, it's got a 7.1 user score, which is surprisingly good when the critical review is a 28. So I think that's great. This is I like this review right here. This guy at the top, he gave it a 10, and he says, "It's a stupid game in every sense of the word, but that's why it's brilliant, lol." That's great.
What was it that Orson Welles said? They'll love me when I'm dead.
Yes, exactly.
So you've gotten your foot back into game development. You have this team. Now, walk me through just the building of this game with this team on the other side of the planet. And so what were the challenges? What was different about developing a game there from what you had developed earlier and the experiences you had at other companies?
Well, I mean, I wrote a really long blog post about this once called Bad Day LA What Went Wrong. But, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And I don't know. Where do I start? So as I had mentioned previously, I had tried to dissuade the owner of this company from letting the team bite off more than it could chew, and he wouldn't hear that. So they were well known for like Sims-like games, basically like a theme park type game, which if you understand like a Roller Coaster Tycoon, things like that, those engines, you wouldn't normally look at that and think like, hey, let's turn this into a third-person action game engine, right? But that was exactly what they did. So our problems started there. that
Wow.
The engine they were using was not suited to the purpose. Now, early on, I wasn't bothered very much because I was only focused on story and art. And so I was writing the story, and I brought on this young kid named Ken Wong, who later went on to become the art director at Spicy Horse. I brought him on board, and this art team in Los Angeles called Cozy and Dan. So I was doing all the things I was really comfortable with, like from afar, which was art and design and writing. But we kept getting these snapshot builds from the team in Hong Kong, and they just never really improved, and they just always looked kind of bad. And you would think like on Rev 1, you could expect that it wasn't going to be great, but by like the 10th or 15th or 100th iteration, you're now 6 months into iterations. We ought to be seeing some kind of improvement in what's showing up on screen, but we weren't seeing that. We were seeing more assets being dumped in, and we were seeing more, art being created, but in terms of the game itself, it wasn't looking great. So I went over a number of times, tried to work directly with the team. I did all of the stuff that I had previously done with other teams that were broken. But the final thing was the owner of that company said, "Look, why don't you just move over to Hong Kong and try to fix it in person, right?" And I had a crazy moment. I was like, "Ooh, move to Hong Kong. All right, I'm gonna do this." So I sold all my stuff. I sold my house. I sold my car. It wasn't because I had any particular faith in that project. I only saw it as a stepping stone. It was like someone in a foreign land was offering me work and a work visa to live in Hong Kong, and I had made some friends over there, and they were all kind of egging me on. So I just left. I was totally, part of it was also I was getting really bored in LA, and I just wanted to get out of my comfort zone. So wow, I did that. So yeah, I went and started working with this team directly, and I started to find that there was all kinds of horribleness going on. Like, the owner of the company was abusing the employees by turning off the air conditioner at 5 p.m., even though he was also telling the employees they had to work overtime until they got certain tasks done, which meant that they would sit in a sweltering hot Hong Kong office with no air conditioning from 5 p.m. until midnight every day.
Wow.
And by the way, when you are working with a development team, obviously all boys, all men, but all of us were sat around in our underwear. That's how hot it was.
Oh, Jesus.
I mean, it was a real experience. And it was weird. I hated it and I loved it, because it was such an adventure. It was so surreal, living in Hong Kong and engaged with this team where the whole team really hated the guy that ran the company. And the guy kept having these crazy, unrealistic expectations about what should be getting done. But while all this was going on, I was taking trips into mainland China, into Guangzhou, which is where the art team was that was building all the art assets, and they were doing a really good job in terms of art.
Sorry, I have to interrupt, but so you had the programmers sitting in Hong Kong. You had originally the designer of the game sitting in the US, but the art assets team was sitting in mainland China.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, sorry. I just needed to say that out loud to understand it. Okay.
Yeah, and like when I signed on for all this, I didn't know that the art team was going to be in Guangdong. I didn't know that. But once I kind of got the lay of the land, I understood it better, because real estate in Hong Kong is really expensive. Salaries in Hong Kong are really expensive. So the team in Hong Kong was maybe only like 15 people, but the team in mainland China was like 30, and the 30 people in mainland China were doing all the art assets and the animation and stuff like that. So yeah, that gave me the opportunity, though, to take multiple trips into Guangzhou, into mainland China. And man, did that open up my eyes. Like, when I moved to Hong Kong, I didn't even think China. I mean, that's how naive I was about the world at the time. But the moment that I set foot on the ground in China, like, I felt like I had energy going through my legs, because I felt it. I felt, wow, this is incredible. This is insane. No one even knows this is all happening here. I mean, there just was people everywhere, and there were, cars racing around and skyscrapers going up. Keeping in mind, this was 2004 or 2004 was the first time I think I ever visited mainland China. And it just blew my mind. And then I started meeting and being invited by friends to go up to Shanghai, which is where I live now. And I had thought that Guangdong was cool, Guangzhou was cool. Man, when I saw Shanghai, I just fell in love with everything about it, And so I was still in Hong Kong, but I was already making my plans to get out once the game was finished. And the game was eventually finished. And I eventually actually ejected myself from it because I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take how nonsensical and unrealistic the whole thing was. And I actually took 1 year off to sit on an island near to Hong Kong and write a movie script for Disney. And then also I was laying the groundwork for everything that was going to happen in Shanghai, because I knew that I was going to leave Hong Kong and move to Shanghai.
Gotcha. And I'm just trying to put all the pieces together in my head. So you're working on something for Disney, but that was a film property, correct?
Right.
Okay. And at the same time, you're thinking about setting up a company. What was it like at that time to set up a company as a foreigner in Shanghai?
So just, the year prior to, I think you can go look it up if it was 2004 or 2005, where China had finally liberalized its foreigner in China business setup system. So prior to that moment, you could only be an RO, like a registered office, which was the foreigner's version of a state-owned enterprise. Basically, up until that point, you had to have some sort of an association with a Chinese company in order to be doing business in China. But in that year prior to my arrival, they had passed new legislation to allow for something called a WOFE, which is a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, which, as the name suggests, it can be wholly owned by foreigners, but doing business legally in China. So I understood that to be the path to starting up a business that I owned and operated in Shanghai. And I had a handful of friends that were already in Shanghai in various parts of the process of setting up businesses. They were all mostly focused on the outsourced business, because even back in that time, and I think a lot of people are unaware of this, but go back 20 years, you had art outsourcers in China producing art assets that went into Western games for EA, for Activision, for Ubisoft, all of these big companies that, were producing games in the quote unquote producing games in the West. They had a footprint in China back then, and they had very large studios that were doing 3D art asset production and then putting those assets into their Western video game titles. So that was the environment that I stepped into, was one where, hey, there's a lot of video game stuff going on here, but it's almost exclusively outsourcing. There was no one set up to do independent development of and start to finish development of Western or games for a global audience.
One question I did have about the Bad Day LA project. So you're developing this in China. You've got a Chinese company that is basically financing the project and getting it off the ground. Was the idea always that the target market was going to be a Western audience? And was there ever any thought to make the game in such a way that it would be usable or marketable on the Chinese market?
Okay. Yeah, so the company that was funding it is called Enlight Software with an E, Enlight, and they are or were Hong Kong based, owned by a Hong Kong guy. And then they had a satellite studio in Guangdong. I mean, as far as the actual legal structure, the nature of the relationship between the Hong Kong thing and the mainland thing, I don't know, because I never really inquired about that. All I know is that we would go there and there was a studio there, and that studio was doing work for the project, for Bad Day LA. At that time, Enlight was a Western game developer / publisher. In other words, they had licensed to, or they were developing original IP that was for global English language game, audiences. So I think some of the other things they did, like one of the ones I know they did, which was quite successful, I don't know if it was under a license or it was one of their own, but it was called Trackmania. And I know that did quite well. And they had some other kind of like theme park simulator type games. I mentioned that earlier, that their in-house engine that they developed for a theme park simulator is what they ended up sort of shoehorning in to do the work of a third-person over-the-shoulder game engines. So anyway, when I was doing all this with them, there was never any conversation about trying to publish in China. The goal of the president or owner of that company at that time was to leverage my name, which meant to try to publish in places where that would be meaningful. And at that time, China was not one of those places.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So now back to where we left off. So you set up a company in Shanghai, and you already mentioned that you brought on some of the people that you had worked on previously with Bad Day LA. That
only
process.
Person.
What?
Only one person.
Oh, only one person.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, it was just myself and Ken Wong. So Ken Wong had worked with me as an artist/art director on previously on my attempt to make a game based on the Wizard of Oz, which that team was in California. And then we did Bad Day LA together, and Ken ended up moving to Hong Kong at the same time that I did to work on that game. And then when I moved to Shanghai to start the new studio, he came along to help out with starting the studio and working on the games there.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, when you started the studio, this is Spicy Horse,
Yep.
in Shanghai, what were your goals? I mean, market-wise, development-wise, what was your idea of what the purpose of the product of Spicy Horse was going to be?
Well, I think I mentioned before, I had seen a lot of things that I thought could be better in terms of how to run not just a game studio in China, but game studios in general. I was always never a fan of things like crunch mode and what it did to people's energy levels and souls and creativity and things like that. So, but to be clear, I mean, Spicy Horse was formed not in a vacuum because I had ideas about what a game studio should be. Spicy Horse was formed in response to a request I received to build a game project for a company called GameTap. So GameTap at that time, I believe they were a subsidiary of Turner. You'll have to look that up, but I think it was Turner Broadcast.
It was Turner.
Yeah. So they were a subsidiary of Turner, whose model or business model was to build, games in an episodic fashion, so that they kind of mirrored or modeled themselves after how television was done. Kind of made sense because that's where the money was coming from. And then GameTap as a platform was built as a subscription and episodic game platform. And they wanted, unique content that was exclusive to their platform to help get the word out that they existed and that you wanted to go over there and sign up and play games on their platform. So in some respects, they were attempting to be a competitor to, say, like a Steam, because they also just offered straight up single player, non-episodic games. And a lot of those were offered for free. I mean, from a financial perspective as a gamer, they were actually a really good deal. But anyway, I was approached by them. Ricardo Sanchez, who was the president or lead or whatever of GameTap, came to me and said, we want you to build one of your games and brand it as one of your games, and we'd love if you did something with Twisted Fairy Tales. What can you give us? And I said, well, I can, I'll do an episodic game based on a bunch of the Grimm's fairy tales, and we'll call it Grimm. And at the time, I didn't have a studio. I made contact with a lot of people in Shanghai, but I had to respond to them by saying, I'd love to do the project, but in order to make it happen, I'll have to build a studio from scratch. And given where my head is at right now and the way that I see the world, I think it's a good idea to do that in Shanghai, China. Now, I expected them to write back and be like, you're joking, right? But instead they said, where do we send the money? So I was as shocked as anyone that they took a leap of faith, not only on me to build and deliver an episodic game, which I'd never done before, but also to build a brand new studio in China at a time when I think a lot of people still had a lot of kind of mysterious misconceptions about what was going on in China.
Gotcha. And so this idea of going with the episodic, now obviously from a developer standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, this was a very different model. You were paying a subscription service, blah, 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 blah. If I remember GameTap correctly, it was a subscription-based thing, right?
Yeah, I believe you paid a couple of dollars per month, and then you got access to their platform, and that meant that, like, whatever it was, let's say it was $5.99 or $9.99 a month, you got access to a giant catalog of old games and of new games and of original games like Grimm.
Gotcha. Now, from a consumer standpoint, that's a very different approach to the acquisition of software. From a developer standpoint, did that change any of your calculus or design decisions? Or was it basically this is just another publisher and you're just delivering software to a publisher?
No, I mean, it was a radical change. It was a little bit insane. So not only were we proposing to go to Shanghai and build an independent game development studio where practically none existed, right? At that time, I don't think that there were any independent Western game development studios that were of a size greater than 1 to 5 people. So the majority of the landscape was populated by outsourced studios, including quite a few large ones run by THQ and Activision and Ubisoft. I mean, Ubisoft also has and had a big publishing office and development and outsourcing studio in Shanghai at the time. So anyway. What was the question again?
How did the move to a subscription service change development?
Well, so yeah, I mean, we had to first get our heads around building a studio in Shanghai, and that goes back to what I was talking about before, of some of the lessons I learned and some of the thoughts I had about running a humane work environment. And never mind the China side of the equation. Like, I had seen and the world had seen bad treatment of game developers anywhere in the world, right? Crunch mode and the like. But then we were also tasked with a project which was going to last 2 years, in which we had to deliver 24 episodes, and presumably each episode based on a unique fairy tale from the Grimm's catalog. And then that we had 1 year in which to get ready with content, and then at the 13th month or the 12th month mark, the content would start coming out on a monthly basis, I think it was, or every 2-week basis. And it, I think, was split into 2 chunks where we did like 12, where it was 1 a week for 12 weeks, and then we had like a 3-month break, and then we had to finish off the year with 12 more, 1 per week. I don't remember exactly how the math worked, but it was a bit insane because, in that first year, before we were actually releasing content, we had to build the studio and get the pipeline in place and do all the design and prototyping, and then start building and setting aside content ready for what was coming, which was having to be on this episodic release schedule. So it was interesting because it actually blended together quite well with my notion that in order to run a humane development process, you have to be incredibly organized and highly scheduled. But that also intersected really nicely with the fact that I figured that we weren't going to get episodic delivery done unless we told ourselves that we were on this incredible schedule and that we had to check the boxes of delivery in a very methodical way. So it was interesting because it was the 2 notions were oddly compatible, like that we weren't going to do crunch, but we were going to deliver on this insane promise. And so then that led to, ensuring that proper constraints were built into what we were saying we were going to deliver, and that proper constraints were built into the complexity of the assets we were going to build or the complexity of the gameplay that we were going to offer. So what we ended up building was something that was a relatively simplistic, some people called it like a Katamari Damacy style of gameplay where you painted the environment and the assets shifted from light to dark. We told story. So it was a very story-driven game with relatively small, very manageable individual chunks of environment that were strung together by story, and then a gameplay mechanic that was relatively simple. So all those constraints and all the planning were kind of different than what you might normally get away with. Publishers would normally push you to deliver the extremes, right? But GameTap wasn't pushing us that way. GameTap was allowing us to employ the constraints necessary to make the successful delivery under the episodic model work. And so, yeah, it required a radical rethinking of a lot of things.
Cool. And so, obviously, it didn't last forever. The GameTap model didn't seem to catch on, at least at that time. We see things like that returning now on console with, what does Xbox call it? It's not Xbox Live, it's something else. Where subscription service, catalog of titles made available, and so forth. So you got this engine up and running, you got this new model up and running of how to develop. Now, the art style of the Grimm games, I don't know if I'm classifying it correctly, but it looks basically like paper build objects. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think there was an attempt to have it be cartoonish, not quite cell shaded, but yeah, quite simple. Although, that's one of the things that we learned in the process of making it, is that making simple art is not simple if you want it to look good, right? And that's a big kind of lesson learned on that you think that simplistic art is going to be easy, but in fact, it's just as hard, if not harder, to do simple and make it look right than to do complex and kind of hide your inabilities in the complexity, if that makes sense. But yeah. How would you describe that? Yeah, I think it was meant to be kind of paper cutout. It was meant to be storybook, and it's very cartoonish. It's very, in the bright side of things, it's very bright, very colorful, very children's bookish, and on the dark side, it's quite grim. Which is the title of the game. It was meant to show the darkest side of the lessons that were meant to be contained in the fairy tales, because that was the whole premise, was that fairy tales have become too Disney-fied, basically, and without the teeth in them, they no longer tell a meaningful, they no longer teach a meaningful story. So let's put the teeth back in them so they once again have some meaning, which I find interesting in the age of Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you follow him or not, but it was a very similar message that he came out with, that, we as a society had lost some of the lessons told, whether it be in fairy tales or in the Bible or in religion in general. We'd lost those things due to over emphasis of political correctness and, the notion that everyone should win and everybody's fine. And so Grimm was pretty early on that message that, hey, if you take the teeth out, there's not much lesson being taught.
Very cool. And this is a style. It's a unique style. It's a beautiful looking style. Now, was it something that was there any translation issues with the Chinese staff that you were working with to understand the aesthetic that you were going for, or even the notion of these fairy tales. Now, granted, I mean, I don't know how widespread this stuff is internationally. Was there an issue in trying to explain the goals you had with the storytelling and graphical elements?
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the things that we struggled with, not only on Grimm but on Alice, was the notion of being surreal. Because one of the things you'll find in Chinese sort of education system is a very literal interpretation of things, and it's quite famous for being education by rote, right? By doing over and over again the same things, and that kind of de-emphasizes the more creative processes that might be fostered in education systems in the West, right? So we certainly had some work to do around the notion of being surreal. But at the same time, the studio really quickly gained a reputation for being a place to go if you were an artist in China and you wanted to work on stuff that was artistically challenging, different, interesting, surreal, right? So the studio naturally attracted people who saw what we were doing and wanted a part in it, right? And we gave there was a sort of filter, if you came to work for us, that your portfolio had to contain a certain level of kind of creative expression, and then you were brought in, and it was pretty easy a lot of times to weed out people who we felt weren't going to fit, and it became a badge of honor for a lot of people in China or a lot of artists in China to come to work for our studio because of that kind of notion, or the I don't know, the idea of this special culture that existed within the company spreading out and people learning about that.
Gotcha. I can imagine. I mean, it's basically a transplant of the West in a very different cultural environment. Was there ever any attempt to distribute the Grimm series in China itself?
I don't think we ever tried to distribute it in China. There were some companies that licensed it, but they weren't successful. We did have a couple of dealings with either Chinese publishers or sort of Asian publishers who were based in, say, Singapore or Malaysia, who tried to distribute the games in local markets or even back into China. But those never met with any sort of success that registered with me, right? We would do the deals, and I think we might have got paid like a license fee or something, but then it would just sort of fizzle out or disappear.
Gotcha. Now, your deal with GameTap lasts for a couple of years, as far as I can see from the Moby Games entries. Did that end just because of GameTap's sort of ending, or was there some other? Did the contract just end and you decided to look elsewhere?
Yeah, well, it was a 2-year project, and we knew it was coming to an end. We also had a sense that the GameTap model wasn't being successful for a number of reasons, and we could see the writing on the wall. So we knew that, first of all, we had fulfilled our obligations, and I think then some. It was quite a feat, just to be clear, like, to deliver 24 episodes, each of them a half hour in length, is 12 hours worth of content done by a team that had not existed prior to the signing of the contract, and who then all moved to Shanghai and built a studio from scratch. And I mean, like, literally from scratch. And and we delivered on time and on budget. We did not go over budget. We did not slip our schedule in any way, shape, or form. I think we delivered within the scope of what was expected. We delivered a good product, and there were problems on the GameTap side that led to it not being successful. But Towards the end of that production, we were already looking for new work, and because I felt at that time we built such a strong team and could show such, good production process and art ability, we went to EA and said, "Hey, we've got this thing over here in China. It's unique, and do you guys want us to pitch for a new Alice game?" And they said yes.
Cool. And so this is Madness Returns,
right?
And I have to ask, as a lawyer, your name was attached to the original Alice, American McGee's Alice. Would EA have been able to do another Alice game, and with or without your name, and with or without your participation?
I think it's a good question. I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm not sure. On a purely technical basis, I think that EA is in possession of a piece of paper that says that I'm limited to working on Alice projects only under the umbrella of the EA IP, but I've been told in years since that's now, since it was signed back in 1998 or something, that the concept of a agreement like that in the state of California and many other states in the United States has become illegal, so that EA is not able to bind me to or prohibit me from work for infinity time, right, without compensation, or something like that. But I think the flip side of that is that EA isn't bound to work with me in order to make an Alice game. Now, I'm sure that they would have been very certain in that answer. Well, we don't need American, right? I only hesitate in that because there's the wrinkle of my being supposedly bound not to work on Alice except with EA. But I've now discovered that that doesn't really stand anymore in today's world. So I think both parties are technically free to do what they want. Now, EA has a piece of paper that says that I've given them my name for use with the games, past, present, and future. Whether or not they would think it was wise to stick my name on a product that I wasn't involved with, I don't think that they would do that, simply because it would just take my coming out and saying, they're sticking my name on the box, but I'm not involved with it, and that would just cause a giant shitstorm, right? Gamers already are looking for excuses to hate on EA. They would just see that as yet another reason why EA is terrible and can't be trusted.
Gotcha. And I mean, and let's face it, that is such a brand with such I want to call it a personal touch. It feels like an author's work, and it probably wouldn't succeed without that vision. But that's, like I said, as somebody who spent way too many hours on the first game.
Well, so one of the things to keep in mind, and I want to be clear about this, is that these games have always been a team effort, right? I can't claim, and it's not right for me to claim that they are what they are because of me. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I'd say that the largest role I play in the shaping of the projects is as the sort of defender of the vision as it pertains to who I think the Alice character is. And there have been battles fought on those grounds. Just as an example, during the production of the first game, someone came to me and suggested that we make her more sexy, and they wanted to know what would happen if you looked up her skirt with the camera in third-person view. And I violently rejected any conversation around that topic, and that put an end to it, right? Another one was on the second game, on Madness Returns. There was a notion put forward by another group that she should be portrayed as unhinged, maniacal, literally insane. And I said that that's not who the character is, and that I didn't want to take it to a hyper-violent place on the grounds of her being totally unhinged, which was what the goal was there. So again, I make these calls as a function not of like, oh, I've got, my artistic vision, right? No, it's more on the basis of I feel like I've got a pretty clear understanding of who I understand the Alice character to be and who I think the audience expects her to be. And then all decisions in terms of the creative flow from that. And I feel like that's just the natural way that it should be with storytelling. Beyond that, I don't feel like the games are all me. There's so much that goes into them from so many people.
Very cool. No, it makes sense. So after GameTap, and you delivered the games, and you go back to EA, and you get and you work out a deal to make another Alice title. What is? This is a much bigger single delivery project. It's not a whole bunch of little chapters. It's a big AAA title. And it's also the first time that this team is working on console, because that game finally does get released on console. Were there any major hurdles in transitioning to multi-platform development, or did that go fairly smoothly?
I think in terms of the technical transition to multi-platform, it was relatively easy because we were using Unreal. We used Unreal for Grimm, and then we used Unreal for Alice. And because the engine had it in the box to press, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you press a button and you've got a console build. That I think made it feel like the console transition wasn't going to be the most risky part of the proposition. Now, EA stipulated that we needed to hire console experts, and we did. We went out and we found people who were able to pad out our experience, and we found really good people who were, wanting to move to China, or who were already in China looking to level up to a bigger gig. We made those people into our Sony platform tech lead, or our Microsoft platform tech lead, and that basically solved that problem, right? And we were really fortunate to have them, because as much as Epic at that time liked to tout that you press the button and you've got a console build, that starts to fall apart towards the end of production when you've got something that is a giant monster that's grown out of control in a bunch of directions and doesn't necessarily want to fit in memory or run smoothly, and needs massaging and optimizing, and that's when you really need to have those experts on board.
You deliver this second Alice product, and I have to ask from a marketing standpoint, because we did cover the fact that the first Alice was a PC-only release. Was there any consideration given to the fact that there might be console gamers that weren't familiar with the original PC game, and how to develop around the idea that they were coming to the franchise for the first time?
So that question would really be a question to ask the marketing team at EA, because they were the ones who had to sort of figure out how to solve that problem. And on our side, as the developer, we were given zero input or latitude, or sort of, we had very little room at the table, I guess you could say, to voice opinions or to have or make any sort of assertions or suggestions about marketing or how marketing should be handled.
Okay, gotcha. You deliver this for EA, and what is the next step for Spicy Horse after that?
Well, we were at a crossroads at that point where we had successfully delivered the game. Again, we were, on time and on budget, and we basically had to pivot. We had a choice between either closing down the studio or pivoting to something new. And I had thought, perhaps EA would be interested in another project with us since we had delivered Madness Returns, on time and on budget. And I think what is a fairly typical kind of fashion, they couldn't make a decision fast enough, even though, this was the train that was coming down the tracks for 2 years. By the time we got to the decision point, there was whatever going on at EA that didn't allow them to say, hey, let's do something else. And it really, for me, it was a question of, should we shut down the studio gracefully at that point, having, had, I guess, like a 4 or 5 year, positive and successful run, or should we try to continue to do work either on new console titles or whatever. And I was really heavily leaning towards shutting down the studio, and doing so with it having, everything we've done being successful and everybody walking away from it happy, right? And I had quite a conversation with my partner at the time, RJ, who was very strongly requesting that we would shut it down. And he thought, look, we've done a good job here. We can all put a little bit of money in our pockets after this project. And honestly, it would have been, we could have shut the studio down, and the studio had enough money in the bank at that time that we all could have retired. I could have retired, RJ could have retired, but I thought, maybe there's more money to be made somewhere, or maybe there's more to do. The thing that really got me, though, was the idea of some of the people that were working in the studio at the time. In particular, we had a couple of expats in the studio that, if the studio shut down, they would have lost their visas. They would have lost their ability to be in China. And they were, some of them, in positions where they weren't going to get jobs at other studios in Shanghai. They would have been forced to go back to the US, and some of them would have been forced to go back to less than ideal situations. So, I struggled quite a lot with it, because on the one hand, I liked the idea of retiring. And on the other hand, I liked the idea of taking care of our people. And I kind of thought, like, well, if we transition to the right thing, maybe I can have a bigger retirement, 5 years from now. Now, in hindsight, I should have taken the money and run. RJ was right. And for anybody who's listening to this, if you ever find yourself at a juncture where you have done all the right things and you have a pile of money and you can make a clean exit, take the clean exit. Take the clean exit and go off for a year on a sabbatical or a semi-retirement, and then come back to it. Don't do what I did. So what I did was I made the executive decision that we would stay in business, and we partnered up with a group of Singaporean VCs who wanted us to transition to making free-to-play mobile games. Because at that time in history, free-to-play mobile games were really taking off. And so that's what we did. We made the transition from being a AAA console title to restructuring, saying goodbye to a lot of people, downsizing quite a bit, and setting ourselves up to be a developer of free-to-play mobile games for a global audience.
Gotcha. And I guess this leads us to I'm probably killing the pronunciation. Akaniro?
Akaniro, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a Japanese word. It means angry red, as in the color red, and it's an angry version of the color red. You know how they say that the Eskimos have 20 different ways to say snow? Well, apparently the Japanese have 20 different ways to say red, and angry red is one of those.
Interesting. And so I guess you already kind of spoiled it. The title wasn't as successful as you had hoped, or what happened there?
Well, I mean, it wasn't the only title. In the next 5 years, we had a mix of successes and failures, all in the free-to-play online, most of them multiplayer game space. All of these titles were built on Unity 3D, and they primarily delivered for PC and mobile, so we didn't do any more console development. And they were almost all of them client-server online games with some degree of multiplayer functionality, and all of them having free-to-play components. In other words, they were free on the initial download and playing, but they had in-game purchases or in-app purchases for currency and coins. So now we had some of them that did quite well. One in particular was called The Gate, and that made quite a bit of money. Akinero in its kind of heyday actually made good money. But all of them suffered from, and I'm actually, to this day, I'm not really clear. I feel like there was an internal battle to squeeze more out of the customers than the customers wanted to have squeezed out of them, versus another way of monetizing or another way of treating the customers. So our team sort of fractured into two sides. On my side, I was very interested in art and story, and then on the other side, there was this insistence on copying highly successful but perhaps highly manipulative mechanics from successful Chinese free-to-play games and trying to put those into the games that we were building and delivering for a Western audience. Now, if we had been doing all of that, 5 years later, we might have been really hugely successful. But we were doing it quite early, and I think a lot of Western audiences were still very sensitive to over monetization and over manipulation within these games. And so that we got a lot of pushback as these mechanics were cranked up. We got a lot of pushback, and then that would result in the slow kind of creeping death of these game titles.
Gotcha. And now you said that you were modeling a lot of this off of games that were popular in China, and I've heard other people talk about how the Chinese market, and you can confirm or refute this, that the Chinese game market, because of very high levels of piracy, was very reliant on these in-game purchases for the game publication to be profitable. And so that's what led to a lot of the monetization in the games. Is that a fair assessment of that evolution over there?
I don't know if it was primarily a piracy issue. I mean, that certainly would be a component of it. But one thing to keep in mind is that for a long time, your typical Chinese consumer of games didn't own their own PC or console. And for a long time, the games weren't playable, at least, meaningful game experiences wasn't available on your phone. So the thing that was really common, really popular in China was these I can say it in Chinese, it's a wangba, an internet cafe. So, internet cafes, people go in there and they play. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but, it might be a room with like 100 or 200 computers in there. And because of the nature of an internet cafe, you want to be able to sign into your last session, and you want to be able to pick up where you left off. And the person providing your gameplay experience wants you having an account in the game that you're then paying for, right? So I don't know that piracy was the main thing. Now, piracy is definitely an issue, but how would you structure a business model around PCs in an internet cafe if you had to build games for that environment? I think you would naturally end up building online games, and you would naturally end up putting in-game monetization into them because that suits the environment, right? The customer can go to any internet cafe and sit down and punch in their login details, and boom, they're back in. And of course, games like World of Warcraft were hugely popular here. So, World of Warcraft would have obviously been one of the exemplars that all Chinese developers looked at and modeled after, which then led to just more and more and more of exclusively online subscription-based or free-to-play type games becoming the de facto standard for the games that people play here. Now, keep in mind, there is a console market here. People do play Sony and Xbox games, and there's a huge it's a huge mobile market here. Companies like EA regularly report that China is their single largest source of mobile game revenue. So it's I don't know that it's just the piracy thing. I just don't think it's that popular for people, or wasn't that popular or possible for people to have game compatible, decent PC systems at home back then.
Gotcha. Okay, no, that's and that actually makes a lot more sense. I mean, it's a theory that it seen floated around, and so actually getting it from somebody who's on site gives much better perspective of what the market looks like. Now, so you guys are currently, just looking at your website, you have a bunch of these mobile games and these type of games listed, but right now you're working on a third Alice title, correct?
Which website are you looking at?
I'm looking at spicyhorse.com. Oh,
it's still up. That's amazing. Okay, I'm looking at it now too. I didn't realize that it was still serving anything. That's amazing.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Because I just saw here that I can get the Grimm series. I've been wanting to play that forever. So I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing after the interview.
But I don't know if it... Well, good luck. I don't know where this money goes.
Oh, really?
I have no idea where any of this goes or how any of this works. I'm surprised that it's still up and running. I'm going to have to make a note here to research what's going on with this website.
Okay. So basically, you're telling me I should wait for you to confirm that before I put in any kind of payment details.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know I don't know what this would do. I guess I'll find out after. I have a feeling you just won't be able to log in.
Okay.
That's my sense. But yeah, I'll have a look when we're done.
Cool. Yeah, no, I just followed the link that was on the Moby Games site, Moby Games entry for Spicy Horse. So does Spicy Horse as a company still exist, or have you created a new corporation for the development of the new Alice title?
Spicy Horse no longer exists. As a legal entity, it was shut down 2 years ago. I think we completed this. So we did. It was a partial sale and a shutdown, and so the thing that was Spicy Horse no longer exists, and I have a new business that I've actually run for the last 5 years. That's called Mysterious, and that's a U.S. and Chinese company, and then all of our new business, everything that we do these days, is done under Mysterious. You can go to mysterious.design if you want to look online. That's like we have an online shop, or you can just go to AmericanMcGee.com to see kind of a mix of the different things I'm working on these days, which includes efforts to try to make a new Alice game. It includes Pirate Jam. It includes like all the physical merchandise stuff that we do.
Oh, very cool. Sorry, I'm looking at mysterious.design right now. That's some awesome artwork.
Yeah. Okay. So we've done, in the time since Alice and the time since all the free-to-play games, So like Mysterious it's myself and my wife and a team of artists, and we do fashion and art prints and jewelry, and we've done playing card games and books and all kinds of stuff. And then one of the things that we're doing, one of the big efforts, and that's powered by Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/AmericanMcGee, that is our attempt to get a new Alice game up and running. And so, yeah, that's all the content, everything that we're doing around trying to build a new Alice game is really contained on Patreon.
Okay, and we'll be adding links to all that in the show notes here.
Right.
And how far along is that project right now?
Well, we've been at it for almost 2 years now. And by way of comparison, it also took us I'd say at least 2 years when we were trying to get everything in place with EA for Madness Returns. It took a very long time. So same situation here. We're working with EA and various potential partners to try to get a new Alice off the ground. But as usual, it's a very slow process.
Gotcha. And the license to use the Alice IP, has that already been obtained, or is that still a negotiation that's ongoing with EA?
So in terms of a new game, for the EA IP, we are still negotiating. In terms of other things that we've done to leverage aspects of the property, the Alice IP is actually split in 2 pieces, and in some sense you could say it's split in 3 pieces if you consider the public domain Alice that it's all based off of. So I did do another project a little while back called Alice Otherlands, and that included art and story and animations and a book, and that was done under the linear rights to the Alice IP, which are not controlled or owned by EA. And so a separate deal was done with the company that owns and controls those rights. And then for the efforts that we're doing for a new game, that's stuff that I've talked to EA and shown EA throughout the process. And they seem to be okay with what we're doing so long as it's in promotion of, trying to get a new game made.
Gotcha.
But there's no license in place for that right now. And then some of the stuff that we do, some of the products that we offer on Mysterious are done just under the public domain aspect of Alice in Wonderland. So, done away from the thing owned by EA.
Gotcha. Makes sense. And so at this point, in your life, in your career, what would you say has been and this is kind of a question I ask everybody that I interview, given all the changes and all the fluctuations you've witnessed, what is the one trend or change in the industry that took hold that surprised you the most? And what is the one change in the industry that you expected to become a big thing that just fizzled out or didn't go anywhere?
I don't know if I can answer that question. Let me think about it for a second. So the thing that happened in the industry that surprised me the most, I have fairly low expectations of what the industry might do or, where it might go. And at the same time, I have had, since the start, like when I was back at ID, I had a sense of the spectator power of games. And so I haven't been surprised by people making lots of money playing games online, because I saw that could have been a thing way back when. I'm not surprised by the failure of VR, because I've tried it and it bothers me after not a long amount of time playing with it. I always feel kind of like this wow factor, but the wow factor wears off really fast and just becomes an annoying factor after not much time. I was never surprised by what's going on with, mobile games increasing in quality to the point where they look like console games of a few years ago. All of this just seems like kind of the inevitable march of progress. Something that surprised me. I don't know. I can't name something that's really shocked me or surprised me. I actually feel like the industry is kind of boring because we still just stare at 2D monitors for the games that we play, right? We still just use mouse and keyboard. I've been using a mouse and keyboard since 1990, whatever. That hasn't changed at all. And a lot of the things we've seen come along that we sort of thought might radically change things didn't. So I don't know. I mean, I always expect that there's going to be a constant increase in the fidelity of the experience, but that seems to follow along with everything going on in the world these days. And so there's nothing shocking or surprising to me about that. So yeah, I don't know.
No,
sorry, I don't have a really good answer for that.
No problem. And I guess then any final thoughts, or because I'm at the end of my notes, unfortunately, but and I've also taken up way more of your time than I had any right to. So, any final thoughts? Any message for the listeners?
I'm never good at these questions, Carl. They're any sort of like broad, general, tell us your thoughts thing. I'm never very good at that. And honestly, like, you and I started off this conversation talking about the state of the world at large. Those kinds of topics generally get me more interested in talking more philosophically than anything that's going on in games. So for me, games are games, and the time that I spend working on the stories and the art in things is for me as much of an escape as I think that games are for the people who play them. And I'm glad to see that they are still that way. If there's anything that I'm concerned about, it's that always creeping attempt to moderate or control what it is that people can say and do in games, what is politically correct, what is inside the Overton window, whatever you want to call it. And so, as a creator, I mean, if I'm ever concerned about anything or shocked about anything, it almost always comes back to that. It's not about the technology. It's about people's freedom to express within the medium. And, outside of that, I mean, my hope, and I think a lot of people's hope, is that it just continues to remain a place where people can freely express and freely explore and have fun.
I think you just said one of the deepest things the deepest answers you could have given to that question.
Okay.
Even if you didn't think you were. Okay.
All right.
American, thank you very, very much for being with us. And I look forward to seeing whatever comes next on this path. Hopefully it's Alice 3 or whatever else comes.
Great, Carl. Well, I appreciate that support and that sentiment.
And to let us know whether or not the old website is still valid or if it's just going to eat my money.
I'm not making any comments about that. I need to go over there myself and mess around with it. I don't know what's going. I'm surprised to see that it's still up and that it's like looks functional. I hope that it's not taking people's money because I'm not getting any of it if it is.
No. Do you still own any of that IP?
Yeah, I own all the IP. I just don't know, what this is connected to. It's saying that you can register, and it looks like I just managed to log in with an old account, and if I try to play one of the games, I don't know. I guess I'll try the Grim download, like you said.
Yeah. Because I didn't have Game Tap back in the day, and I remember seeing this game, and I was like, "Oh, that looks great," and then it basically lost track of it. It would be a fun thing to try to catch up on.
I hope it's not taking people's money. I'm just now trying to go through PayPal to pay, and it looks like it fails, as it should. I mean, it shouldn't be hooked up to anything anymore. And where else can you? I mean, Grim at this point, you just go online and find it. People pirate it, and you've got my permission to pirate it because it's out there.
I won't add this part to the. I won't add this part to the interview.
Oh, look, that we didn't touch on it, but that was one of the reasons that it failed, was because the marketing team at GameTap was sending out unencrypted, untraced review copies to the world weeks and months before we put them on the platform. And so they were all over the pirate nets before they ever debuted on GameTap. And on GameTap, they had an encryption system. They had a system to stop piracy and to limit people playing them to GameTap. But the marketing team sent these things out in mass. And we started finding them popping up online, being played by people for free before we ever launched them on the platform. And it was maddening. And so that was one of the reasons that it failed. And I'm to this day, I'm still, in disbelief at how idiotic that was, and still angry about it too, because we told them multiple times to stop doing that, and they kept telling us that they didn't know how else to do their job if they didn't send out review copies. And it didn't matter how many times we told them, give people access to review on the platform, not by sending out unencrypted review copies. And they would tell us that they didn't want to bother people with having to create a login because that would limit the number of people who reviewed it. And then we would be like, yeah, well, all the piracy limits the number of people who play it,
oh, jeez.
Yeah, so don't feel bad about pirating it. It's been being pirated since before it was ever released.
I'm looking right now at Steam. It's actually still listed on Steam.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first episode is free, and then each subsequent one is 99 cents.
Yeah, so, I lost access to our Spicy Horse Steam account a long time ago, and I think money's getting made there, but I don't know where it goes. I think it just goes to Valve or something, and it's not great. So.
Oh, geez. Oh, I'm sorry. It just sounds kind of like a mess. But okay.
Yeah,
and now
when companies go to die, sometimes the death process is messy, right? And in our case, it was relatively messy, the way in which Spicy Horse sort of semi-died, semi-sold, and especially for the things that had existed with the team 5 years, or, because between the moment of Grim and the moment of the company's end, there was a period of 8 years in between the two events. And in 8 years, there had been a multiple changing of the guard. There were people at Spicy Horse who never heard of Grim and didn't care about Grim, and so.
Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, weird. All right. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.